Luis Ponce, I'm the Director of Research and Strategic Campaign for ETIU Local 105. I also coordinate the Green Janitorial Program in the Mile High City. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I didn't know you were hiding.
Stephen Shepard, I'm the Executive Vice President, Chief Staff Officer for Building Owners and Managers. So
And I've put him in charge of a task and he's giving you all stickies about your small groups. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Hi, Chris Chiari Patterson in representing small business, and I'll be at 12 Spirits Tavern, my little bar under the hotel. That game tonight, and you should all come. Mine is your come. Patterson in 420 East 11 down.
Be there, be square.
Right around the corner.
That's perfect. Thank you. Everyone's invited. Sounds like.
I'm Scott Paxton. I'm with A1 Organics. I'm here in place of Clinton. I've been with A1 Organics since 2014. And started with A1 Organics when they still had a collection as far as the nuggets are concerned, is that I one time did a skit with Rocky on the floor of a game many years ago.
That's a significant claim to fame.
Other than that, I probably won't watch the game.
Thanks.
I'm just not
Thanks
even
for your candor.
much as the general rules.
Fair enough. Christy.
Scott also knows like all the best hidden heights in Colorado, but he won't tell you. I'm Christy Turner, founder of the Craft, and board member of the Apartment Association of Metro Denver and Colorado Apartment Association. Got out of town friends in town.
Joel Clark, and represent City Council for meeting. We have one more meeting. I think this might be. And then I will be replaced by, and I like to claim the fame about the Nuggets, which I have presented an event tonight, and so I will work part of the game. Hopefully, I will see some of it. But I was once an extra in the made-for-TV version of The Shining with the guy who is Rocky. Rocky. So I can pause it at one point. There's this blurry basketball game in a throwback, and me and all my buddies are playing basketball with Rocky, and then he had to go and break the backboard and the shadows everywhere. It was awful. We shot for like 8 hours and pause it, there's a blur, and it was horrible. But I got to meet Rocky without the Rocky.
Thank you. Can we pause for a minute and Councilman-elect Sarah Parody, can you introduce yours?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. And I'm really excited to be serving on this task force. I'm super excited about all things, race related, honestly.
You're in good company here. This is a support group for
And I
that.
will also say that I think I owe emails to like 7 people in this room, so I feel like it's very brave. I'm here today. Thanks, I'm excited.
Nice to see you. Very brave. Ryan.
Everyone, Brian calls EcoCycle here, and I will just catch the highlights of the game later.
Brittany Ortiz with Eventful Productions. It is event season, so I will be on that topic.
I'm Chris Woodburn with Denver Public Schools Sustainability, and I'll be watching it as my 6-year-old. I'm Chris Hines. I don't know, probably the only Chris here in the
No.
Serve on Denver City Council representing District 10, Denver's Perfect 10, which is the city center. I hate to admit this, but I have a side hustle, and I'll be working on my side hustle. It wraps up next Tuesday. So the side hustle will be taking up all my time.
You share what the side hustle is.
I'm a candidate for re-election. So, so Tuesday at 7 p.m. I'll be at his place, celebrating a victory.
Yes.
Oh, and Sarah, the one time in my life that I've had the most information come at me at any one time was the day after it all. I got Facebook used to have a 99 badge, and it was like that. I would check it all, or I would just clear it out, and then an hour later it would be 99 again. And so,
Get some sleep.
yeah. So you're not the only one who's a little delayed or ended up dropping some.
Thank you. And
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna from Ski Construction representing contractors. And I read this morning that Rocky, the mascot, is the best paid mascot at $650,000 a year. And I used to be my high school mascot, so I'm feeling like maybe.
Also, oldest mascot in
I didn't know.
by a significant margin. He's in his fifties.
Got it.
Okay.
Is it the good scale of the newest Rocky? Because they.
all right, Chris.
My name is Chris Berry. As of today, I'm no longer an employee of GFL Environmental. Their Colorado assets were sold to Republic Services. And so Republic Services took over today, nor am I an employee of Republic Service.
Well,
So you might say I'm a free agent with some opportunities in front.
I hear that being a mascot is really well paid. Um,
650,000.
thanks,
Yeah.
Chris.
Yeah, you can.
Rose, yeah, and you can explain how you're standing in.
Okay, yes. So I'm Rose Rodriguez and I work with Taylor Morrison. I'm representing the HBA of Metro Denver today. JW Hauser, my counterpart, is usually in this slot. He's our license holder within the city of Denver. But I felt like a natural step in for him. He is currently in Italy, which I think is not, yes. So I would certainly rather be there. I'm sure he would rather be here.
Rose, will you remind me what entity you're with?
Okay.
What entity that you're with?
HBA.
APA, thank you.
And where am I watching the game tonight? I'm a Lakers fan. The rest of my family is a Nuggets fan. And so it's been a heated household. They think like basketball. We'll be watching it from home. So we can all sit at the room.
Maggie.
I'm Maggie Nichols. I work for Airborne Construction. I represent the contractors, construction and homes.
Great.
Marguerite, an active citizen, I feel the pension Logan right here. And I'm an HOA board member and it's a small apartment building, so representing just that demographic. And I will be watching it at Charlie Brown's and I suggest everyone come for 2-for-1 drinks after this, if you feel like it, not to compete with 12 years.
It can be aggressive. Progression. Okay, let's go to city staff, but how many
Actually,
task
can we
force
start with-
members? Yeah, do we have online?
Got Lori, Sonia, Erwin, Van, Allison, Jesse. Got about 6.
Okay, and are we able to put them up to introduce themselves, or are we just
They
gonna?
will be able to, you'll be able to hear them,
Okay.
not see them.
Okay, so those task force members are here. They will be listening in, and we miss you all at the meeting. Let's do a quick go around, and I know, and I apologize, it's definitely, these hybrid meetings are tough. And thank you everyone so much for your patience, especially the folks online, because it is really, can be really frustrating and it's less than optimal, and we appreciate you being here in that class. Can we do a quick go around with staff and maybe actually start with Naomi from the Denver Foundation, our host?
Just wanted to give Naomi a chance to introduce herself. Thank you, Naomi, for offering your space. This is amazing. And wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the Denver Foundation.
Yeah, well, welcome to the Leadership Center. We moved into this building. I'm not sure exactly when, but in the pandemic, but when we were looking for a space, do you mind getting the door for, oh, no, they're in. When we were looking for a space, there was a lot of considerations, but the biggest thing was having a space we could offer to community. So we hosted board retreats, nonprofit strategy sessions, and for me, it's really exciting to host this meeting because we were support for everyone to know more about the show. And I actually one of the handful of members on our staff green team. So you'll see we have composting. We're working really hard to change our behaviors in terms of our ordering, but also our waste management. So it's cool to be a part of this. And her background, we're a community foundation. We've been in existence for almost 100 years. We engage in grant making across the 7 counties in Metro Denver, and environment and climate is a focus for us. Grant making perspective, but policy perspective too. So I will be popping in and out, save some other calls, but really happy to have you all here. I think a couple of you have myself. If you need anything, just text me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks
you,
for
Naomi.
having us.
Oh, Wi-Fi on the wall, and the bathrooms are right here. If anyone needs to take a call, you're welcome to decide.
Thank you so much. Blake, do you want to start?
please.
Just to go around with stuff.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Blake Adams. I'm the Zero Waste and Circular Economy Manager for City and County of Denver. I think it's the first time I'm meeting most, if not all of you in person, so this is amazing. Welcome. Anna?
My name's Anna Erickson. I work with Blake on the Zero Waste and Circular Economy team and help run the disposable bag fee program and sticker stuff program. Happy to be here and support.
Hey everyone, I'm Erica Rogers. I'm the policy director in excise and licenses, so I'm helping support today with some of the.
Yeah, thank you both.
Hi, everybody. I am Liz Adams. I'm the deputy director in the fire.
Thanks for being here. Oh, we missed you, Andrea.
Sorry.
And we have also Ian just joined. So how about Andrea and then Ian?
Yes.
I'm Andrea Furness, and I'm a task force member representing and like Renee, I will be working. That's you, here we are.
You're just saying hello?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also where you're watching the Nuggets game is the other question.
Where am I watching?
If you would
that?
like to.
House party? Ian Boya, one of the co-authors and directors of the Westmore Initiative.
Thanks. Okay, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Jessica Lally. I'm with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure.
Jill.
Hi, Jill Jennings, Deputy Director for Community Planning and Development.
Nina Waysworth, I'm with Department of Transportation and Infrastructure as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robert Keith. I'm our Director of Development System Performance in the Mayor's Office. I work closely with all the agencies that engage in construction and similar areas. And I'll be watching the game from the comfort of my house.
I'm Greg Thomas, Director of Environmental Quality and Public Health and Environment. Fan of all things waste.
And I'm Ryan Golton, just met most of you, with the Consensus Building Institute, and my younger child, my son, has decided he's gone from wanting to play in the NFL and NHL, which he really still wants to wanting to be a mascot in his professional career. So that's it. He's also in good company. So thanks, everybody. And we have a number of folks online. I think both task force members, staff. Is Grace joining online? Is she? Yeah. Okay.
Grace is on.
Grace is online.
She's on a top secret mission.
And,
I'm here. Hi, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there with you. I'm at a conference with the mayor.
we're glad you could make it on Zoom. And members of the public, so thanks. Let me just do a quick rundown of what we're doing tonight, and then we'll get into it. So all of you have seen hopefully the agenda, and the main thing we're doing in the bulk of tonight's meeting, looking at some preliminary recommendations. So this is the first chance that you all will have to see those things that are coming out of the work groups, and work groups are coming hard on a lot of them. So this is a chance to see what they're thinking, hear from the work group members, provide input, and hopefully get some green light to proceed in concept. And before that, we'll do a couple of updates, just what happened between the May meeting and now. And then we're gonna spend the latter part of the meeting talking about enforcement and compliance. And a lot of you have had a number of questions about that. We're gonna have some small group discussions around what you all think is the right balance in terms of enforcement tools. And then that's basically, that's the bulk of the meeting. We're gonna try to wrap up. So, and before that, just a couple of notes in terms of how we're doing this. Because the owl picks up everything, I'm just gonna ask everyone to minimize that conversations, because I know it was hard at the last meeting. It was really hard at time. Hopefully everyone's reviewed all the materials that have pointed to do. I mean, everyone has recommendations generally, but we will cover them. Input and ask questions. So then let's see. Lastly, if this is your first meeting, or if you've missed recent meetings, feel free at the break or after the meeting to just come find a staff person, a task force member, somebody, and we can help you up to speed on whatever questions you might have. So feel free to just jot down the questions you have. And so I think that's any other housekeeping matters before we.
I do have a couple physical copies of recommendations and the summary of last meeting, just in case somebody wants to have them in front of you. You don't have many, trying to save on the paper, but we do have those.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that, I think you can progress the slide Anna, to the main recap. So there's just a couple of quick follow-up items from me before we dive into recommendations. And so Anna, you can progress slides. And so first of all, just a reminder, here's where we are. This is our fourth meeting. So we are tonight looking at draft recommendations and enforcement mechanisms. We're going to have a quick look ahead to the public engagement month in August. We'll talk about that as well. And then the next meeting is where we start getting into universal signage, messaging, community buy-in, and communication. And so that work group, if you're on that work group and you signed up for it, you're going to be meeting sometime after today's meeting. And then we will look through the overall recommendation proposals so far, so that we have a package of high-level recommendations to show in terms of where you all are. Right? And then we're going to take off the month. The plan is to take the month of August, do a whole month of public outreach and input, and then in September come back to what may have been heard from the public and try to wrap up. That's the plan. That's the idea. And Anna, you can grasp. In terms of just a recap from May, those of you may remember that the May meeting we really focused on equity and how who is it that needs to be prioritized and looked out for in particular, what buildings, what communities, what neighborhoods, what entities in implementing ways no more to ensure that it's equitable. And so there were some updates to the evaluation rubric. And those of you in the equity work group, you worked on it. So if anyone from the equity work group has anything more to say other than the fact that you all looked at staff and you all looked at the input that was received, you updated the rubric accordingly, and we'll be walking through that rubric today as we look through the recommendations, how the staff is evaluating. Anything from the equity work group on that? And then lastly, you all may remember you took a bit of a deep dive, brainstorm into supports and incentives. You filled out fleshed out a chart, and that is included in the May 4th meeting summary. If you haven't looked at that, it's all there in terms of the brainstorm of what supports and incentives are really important. And staff and the workers are using those in draft. So that's essentially. Any questions or comments? Closing the loop. And then as we transition into the recommendations, can you go back real quick, just to one quick thing to note? That basically, just so you all know, I know that a couple of people asked last time, can we clarify in June at tonight's meeting, what's the process that we're going through to come up with recommendations? And what happens when they get presented like tonight as an initial proposal, the work with and people have questions or comments or notes or whatever. So this is the process at this point. You all have a general discussion about a topic. It goes to the work group to come up with actually some sort of vetted proposal. It comes back to you all as a task force, and then you all opine, and then city staff in consultation with the work groups after tonight's meeting will take any input that you all may have on those recommendations, come up with any refinements, use them, and then come back to the next task force meeting, hopefully for your back. So tonight, we're going to hope to get a green light, thumbs up, this is good, here's some tweaks, here's some suggestions, and then there'll be a final recommendation. That generally makes sense to those of you who ask that question. All right, I think we're ready, Anna, to dive in. So with this, I'm going to pass it, I think, to Erica. Are you starting? Okay, and I think just with the idea that you're going to hear there are 6 recommendations that you all saw in your email packet. These were developed by the workers. We're asking tonight, basically, do people have questions? Does anyone have heartburn about any of these things? Or do you have just friendly amendments or suggestions? I think those are really good. All right, so I'm going to kick it off with our first 2.
But before we dive in, just want to go over what you'll be seeing in the next chunk of the meeting. So ready for review today are those that you got in your email. Two that talk about defining effective premise and responsible party. Two that talk about the timeline for compliance for residential and non-residential buildings. One about the annual diversion plan and one about court. One thing to keep in mind is we're looking for these six. These are the base level recommendations. These are the ones we need to get a thumbs up first before we move on to some of the other recommendations that we're currently developing based on your feedback in the first couple of meetings. So at the next meeting, we'll probably talk more about compliance timeline for food-based producers, and compliance for C&D, covered materials exemption, city purchasing requirements, and contracting. Once we get like I said, the green light on kind of this base level recommendations, we can go deeper into these other ones that you guys have been talking about last meeting. To the extent you think, hey, wait a minute, I thought we talked about that, it might be someone else. Feel free to ask. All right, so first, recommendation one, we're going to start with the two easy ones, and then I'll kick it to Blake to talk a little bit about the harder ones. But the first two are pretty straightforward. They talk about definition. I think what we heard by and large from this group is that we need a definition for what the physical space is that is the effective, right? The ordinance alludes to it. There's some questions, there's some clarity that could be added, right? And so this first recommendation in short is that the ordinance should include definitions for all of the applicable effective premises covered under the ordinance, whether that's an effective premises within a residential building, within a non-residential building, within a compostable waste producer, what's the effective premises for a food truck, right? So at a base level, we need a definition for that. And then another thing that we heard from this is that wherever possible, if we could tie that definition of effective premises to existing practices or definitions that people who are going to be regulated in this ordinance are familiar with, if we could create efficiencies there, that would both reduce the administrative staff trying to understand who's responsible, what parts are responsible, and also for the folks who have those created. A building owner or your business owner, say for example, you've got a liquor license. Is the effective premises license premises or is it your right? Well, some clarification in that definition. When we ran it through the equity rubric, which you'll see in the full document, oops. Screen. Okay.
Apologies for that.
That's all right. When we ran it through the equity rubric, in the document you got to see the full analysis, but it's scored moderately with a 5, and that's because anytime you can add definitions that provide transparency and clarity on how things are being interpreted, that of course leads to everyone being more on the same page, which is a larger, more equitable result. However, it doesn't necessarily significantly improve equity outcomes within that. So it kind of towards their right in the best practice that both Denver and other jurisdictions use to define terms, but it's not going to increase an equity outcome in by specific now. It's word written. And like I mentioned, what we heard about this again, providing that clarity will help everyone with responsibility under the ordinance understand what they have to do to comply. By reducing that confusion, we're hoping to help people be as clear. So that's kind of the gist of first. Before we chat about it, let's also talk about the second recommendation because it's very so to piggyback off of defining effective premises, we also use the term party. And so adding a definition for who is the responsible party will also with that clarity, right? Just like people want to know, all right, is it my license premises? Is it full premises? What about a food truck? How far out should I go? They also want to know who is the responsible party. Is it the owner? Is it the manager? Does it vary based on the residential building, the licensed business? So adding some definitions, and again, where they can tie into existing business practices so that it makes sense for the core business owner or if you come to outside and licensing, and you know how standard things work with your business license. If it lines up with there, we can create efficiencies for those business folks by knowing, oh yeah, owners and operators are responsible for FID. Here, it makes sense here too. To the extent possible, the recommendation that we heard was, you know, make those consistent across the board, so that people aren't having to comply with a bunch of again, on the equity score, it got 5, moderate, medium, for the same reason, right? Defining terms of art in the ordinance, provide that transparency, that consistency, that ability for everyone to be on the same page of who is the party, but it doesn't create a measurable equity outcome change. Things were there, and again, same with just the reason why we adopted this recommendation is because we heard that this was something that will help, and that's always the goal. With that overview of the first 2 recommendations, I'll open it up for comments, questions. The main question being, does anyone have any heartburn with moving forward with these recommendations? Does anyone have clarification questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry, it's just like what we heard. It looked a little bit clear maybe online.
So what we heard, I assume, from both the task force meetings and the work.
Yeah, all of the meetings that you've all been in, we kicked off. Yeah, more. So when we talk more about the process, the end goal is that we're going to have a report that will be given to the city attorney's office to draft ordinances all the time. They will be able to find all of these things, right? Like the efficiencies of where we can tie into it, or how we use the definitions, right? There may be a really efficient way to do it. And this task force, you're all experts in the experts, you know. So this recommendation is broad. It says we need a definition where possible, make it make sense, right? Have it supported with you. Kind of those common sense lines, and here's why we want it, and then the attorney can take that, you know, or the legal word, and kind of get it.
I don't think anyone thought that, like, these are not controversial, but they have come up a number of times in the first meeting or 2 in terms of vagueness or like some confusion. So anyway, I think we figured everyone was like, yeah, moving on.
And they'll also get in the report, they'll get the notes, like all the little caveats that we talked about, right? Like I know in one of my work groups I was in, to talk about you know, owner versus managers, and another group was for, you know, the compostable waste producer. What about pools, right? Like they produce food waste, they're similar to this, but why aren't they in there? And so they'll get all of it. So this is just kind of a draw with all of that.
And before we move on, because people probably sounds like people are good, just remember that what Erica's presenting here captures that high level takeaways from these data that you all got. But this is only meant to summarize.
It's not that the chief will please want to get.
Yeah.
So yeah, the report contains all of the documents, all the meeting summaries, all of the work with summaries, what these you know, this would make sense, will all be part of it.
Brian,
Yes, go ahead, Grace.
is it possible to repeat the question asked by the audience? It's really hard to hear it from the online, so we can't really understand what's being the response to.
Thank you, Sophia.
Make a note to do that.
That's great. So the first question was, is this sort of a gratuitous exercise? Because don't we need to define these things anyway? And so that was what Erica was just talking about. And the second question was just getting clarification of, okay, so the task force is going to have a recommendation to go define these things. And is the attorney's office and the council gonna actually see some of the other nuanced suggestions that have come out of the task force, and you heard Erica's response about all the summaries from the work from the task force discussions that will accompany the final report. So that the council will see the full range of comments, as will the attorney.
Yeah, and just to expand a bit on the recommendation format, and again, we didn't print out copies for everyone. We're trying to save on the paper. There is a little bit more nuance about tying them to existing definitions in the existing code, right? And then some considerations as well about not all premises described by the ordinance like neatly fall into definitions, and there's some work to do there. So there is a bit of nuance to work through as well.
Yeah, excuse me.
So is it right to assume that the task force will see like the definitions, everything before they go to council, so that if there are questions and clarifications that we still need to happen,
That's a
that
great
you can do
question.
that before it gets into code and then causes.
A great question, right? So right now, we're in the task force process, and we have a slide about this, I think, at the end of the recommendations, right? For the recommendations turn into our report.
Right.
That report then, we have a public input on the report. But that report ultimately will get sent to a city attorney or a team of city attorneys probably, who will draft an ordinance. It'll go through some internal processes, but yeah, that draft ordinance, I think Catherine has made commitment that, and if Grace is on and I'm saying anything wrong, please tell me, but it's my understanding that there would be some sort of public process once there's a draft to review, and it would say, here's what the report said, here's what we drafted, here's why we drafted what we drafted. And then, all the public and this task will be invited to say like, yep, that sounds good. That's what we had in mind when we wrote the recommendation.
Okay.
And then it would go to city council. And the idea is by the time it gets to the city council, everyone feels pretty happy with it.
Erica, are you
Thank you.
speaking about like after the task force makes its recommendations, finalizes its report, then we staff go and write the actual ordinance? There is a legally required process that ordinances have to be, made available for public comment for a 30-day period before we go to council. So is that what you're referencing?
Yes. Yes.
And Grace and Sophia, are you able to hear, like when Erica is speaking right now, are you able to hear online?
I could hear her. There's a little bit of choppiness, and I can't tell if it's just like a digital delay or if it's because Erica's further from the owl than you are. But I can hear okay.
Yeah, I can hear.
Possible just to skip ahead to that slide for visual people,
Sure.
The process, but
kind of reply to all the recommendations.
yes. Yes. I think we're doing that now. So we're going to skip ahead to the slide that gets to the process of what happens after the task force.
Yeah, so for visual people, I'm also a visual person, so I like the smart art, and PowerPoint is like my best friend. So,
And Erica, you might have to speak up just a little or come closer. Yeah.
okay, so the idea is that we're going to go through these recommendations today, right? You'll kind of give the general, like, yeah, this is what we were thinking. Add tweaks. We'll also have about a week after this meeting if you want to send any additional thoughts. Sometimes, you're walking to work and you're like, oh, I have an additional thought that I didn't think of in the meeting. You can send that to the Waste No More team. And then at July's meeting, we'll finish up reviewing the additional recommendations, the ones that are in development, or any tweaks to the ones we talked about today. In August, all of the accepted recommendations that this group agrees on, either from today or next meeting, those are going to be published on the CASR website. And that's when members of the public and key constituents will have the opportunity to submit feedback. I know we've talked about doing that in a bunch of different ways. So that would be that time to weigh in just on the recommendation, right? To say, are there any big gaps, right? Or thoughts or tweaks. And then using that feedback, city staff will kind of review those comments that we get from the public or those key stakeholders with the task force at that September time. And then we can make any adjustments if necessary, right? If we get a public comment and, this group is like, oh, wow, that's a really great idea, we should incorporate that. Let's add it to the recommendations. That's when we will do that. And then finally, the end of the process would be the finalizing of that report. It would be published, it would be shared. And that's when it would go to the team with the city attorney's office, who could begin drafting, the ordinance language that is in line with all of those recommendations in the report. Now, what I will say about this, right, this is our process, this is our task force process. There's a whole nother legislative process that comes once we have a draft of the ordinance, but we'll go over that next time because, you know, this is kind of our key timeline to focus on, and then, you know, there'll be additional time for public input, right, like at city council or before, between the time there's a draft and it gets filed, that kind of stuff, but as far as the recommendations, this is the process, that we're trying to finish up by the fall.
And we can come back to, we were planning on spending a little time on this after going through the recommendations, so we can come back to this, but does anyone have any major questions? Yeah.
Not major, just out of
Go ahead.
curiosity, what does that mean, the key constituents, like members of the public, and who are the key constituents?
I think, Grace had mentioned, right, like in some of the small groups, there were, you know, you are all representatives of the groups that you know, are here today, and there may be some additional outreach needed, right, on certain specific, you know, with certain specific groups. So, I don't know if, those smaller groups would recommend like a focus group or something, but, if those ideas are pursued, that's when that would happen.
Yeah, if you all want to engage, like if FOMO wants to have a meeting and you, right, exactly. That would happen then. And the city, I think, is planning on supporting you to the degree, you know, possible. So any other questions about this? And then we'll come back to the recommendations. Yeah.
Joel and I were just chatting with a little bit,
I was,
just for the,
for Jack.
just
Oh.
for the recommendations in general, that legislative track that could be as January seems possible by the time it actually hit council. And the only reason I say that is because I think it's relevant to the deadline recommendations about like when a year would apply.
Yeah.
Sounds like it would be 2024 is when the date would be in 25, 6, 7. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to.
Yeah, based on the way you're extrapolating it, absolutely. Yeah.
Sophia and folks online, could you hear Ian just now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I just one note about that too, right? And I think, you know, you're aware of this, but for anyone who might not be, right, we are going to have a new mayor. We might have some new council folks. Well, we will have some new council folks, right? Sarah, for example. And so, you know, there are some onboarding stuff that everyone's going to have to do. Budget season is in the fall. So, you know, we also know how the legislative process has worked in the Hancock administration with anyone who knows Guy Stewart, how that worked. But we may have a slightly different process. So just keep that in mind too, right? Like there's certain uncertainty there. We are going to do our best to continue pushing this forward because of those deadlines, right? And they need to be updated. But just know that that might be a little bit outside of this group's control. And it doesn't mean we're not pushing ahead. So.
Yeah, there's a strong commitment. Yeah, to keep it going. Okay, so that's, are we, oh, Ryan.
Quick question. I know we generally send out the PowerPoint after the meeting. It's kind of hard for me to see. Is it possible to send it out now?
So I thank you so much for mentioning that. I meant to tell you right before this meeting, I put it in your shared folder. So if you all go, for those of you who have your computer, you can go to your shared folder under to today's meeting and you will see the PowerPoint. And if you can't get there, let me know, but it should be there. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Any other questions before we keep going on the recommendations? Okay.
Brian, one question.
Yeah,
So
and
they just notified all contractors that they have to submit reuse and recycling information starting June 2023. So how starting today.
Yeah.
So how does that work with the timeline if it gets voted on in January to postpone it?
Is working well. Speak to that.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you, Jill.
So hi, Jill Jennings.
Jill, you'll have to speak up because of the owl. Sorry.
Sorry, I have to get out of the seat.
Yeah.
Hi, Jill Jennings, Bullock, Community Planning and Development. So per the initiative that was passed, that is law, there is a requirement, June 1st, for construction and demolition, you're supposed to start submitting recycling and reuse plans. So we have taken a very sort of light approach. We put a form together. It's very sort of straightforward that says, what do you expect to recycle? How much do you expect to go to landfill? And then at the end of the project, you would submit a compliance. So that's really all we're doing right now. If it changes, obviously we will change what we're doing, but we felt like we had to move forward, given the law that's in place.
And so that wouldn't get rolled back starting in January.
I don't know.
It will be up for discussion in the next meeting. I think we've got some work to do on. Today, we're going to be focusing on buildings, that some of the definitions, and next time we're going to get to C&D as well as food waste producers and that sort of side of the ordinance. So there's plenty of room for discussion on phasing in for C&D.
We're gonna meet one more time.
Yes.
Working group between now and then.
So, online folks, Jessica just mentioned the C&D working group is still meeting, will still meet at least one more time. And so that Anna's question is gonna definitely be addressed there. But to the extent that it's relevant and you wanna, keep it on the radar for this meeting, feel free to keep raising it.
And if you've got questions, email me. Thanks.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you can email me also, just either Jill or myself.
And Jill and Robert, on a break or something, do you mind putting your emails up on the whiteboard maybe, or even back there? Would be great. Okay, thank you so much. All right. Now we get into the phase, Ian sort of segued us a little bit into the next set of recommendations, but Anna.
We did have an online question about these two recommendations. Will the definitions allow Denver to effectively enforce against the responsible party? Or will all parties be dragged into court and assess some portion of liability?
That's really going to be a question for the small group discussions today about what enforcement tools feel appropriate for this ordinance, given that there's nothing in the ballot language, right? What tools feel right for Denver? So
yeah,
I think the definitions will be crafted obviously in tandem with any recommendations this group comes up with, the enforcement and compliance tools that feel best.
And just in terms of members of the public who are here online on the call, we're gonna have small group discussions for the task force members, and we're gonna then reconvene with everybody afterwards. But if members of the public have input on these questions that we're gonna be asking the small groups, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can also send them to Cassar on the email that's on the website, because all of that is really relevant. We're just gonna focus on the task force comments.
Christy?
Anna's question and that comment jogged my memory here. What was the thought behind having a complaint form already on the Waste No More page, given that you haven't actually reached like proper implementation? Isn't that a bit confusing for the small public?
This is Grace. Could I take that one?
Yes, please.
Because we had already started receiving emails from people, and we haven't received a lot, but it's been entirely from apartment dwellers. And some people were already reaching out to the mayor's office as well to complain about their buildings not having recycling or composting. So we went ahead and created that form to make it easier for people to submit that information to us. And then we follow up by reaching out to the building to make sure they're aware of the ordinance. But we're not taking any enforcement actions against buildings yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
Okay, so we've gone a lot of different directions. To remind everyone, we are looking at recommendation 1 and 2, adding this group would be saying, we recommend that the ordinance be updated to have definitions for responsible party and effective premises so that everyone can comply. And where there are efficiencies or burden reductions on small businesses or business owners or operators, right? People who are trying to comply, those efficiencies and burden reductions to be explored. Does everyone feel comfortable with that, kind of general direction for these two recommendations, given that you have kind of another week to review the document, submit any additional concerns or questions?
And I think the question really is like, any heartburn on this before we?
The ordinance writer that is going to do the report that comes up with these definitions, where does that fit in with the task force timeline? Is it? That's after. But there will be, that's part of the legislative drafting process. There are public input periods in there as well.
And it sounds like, I think this is what I heard from you, Erica, and Grace, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the task force will be getting that package. So you all can compare and look and see, is that consistent with what we recommended? And if you have any concerns, that will be a time that you as a task force member will be able to bring that up. Yeah.
We will be able to bring it up as a task force member, but the charter of our purpose as a task force and schedule meetings to convene will have happened.
I think that's right, but Grace, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've heard you say is that you all have a lot of weight as task force members. This is going to go to council. The goal of the city is to have you all be able to be like, yes, this is consistent with our recommendations.
I personally was hoping we would have had definitions to make decisions on at this stage, not something that will happen long after our charter was expired.
Yeah.
Hey, if I could interject, Erica, maybe like one of the, what these two recommendations do is they essentially direct us at the city to keep our definitions consistent with other areas of the code that already define these terms. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to pull those definitions out and provide them to the task force,
Oh, great.
right?
So
I think
I don't
the bigger question for the task force is, and I think Blake is going to get to this in probably later in the discussion. There are unique terms in this ordinance that are not referenced in other parts of the city code. Those are places where we will need the task force to weigh in.
Yeah.
And that will happen before your process is done.
My recommendation would be then to amend what you're asking us to do, to include the preservation of any undefined terminology from the originators of the ordinance, and expect then the city to define or come up with regional definitions and explanations for it.
Brian, you got that?
Yeah, so I think what I heard is to amend this to direct the city, to ask the city to preserve any undefined terminology that the original drafters put in the ordinance and have those.
Make sure that the original intent is preserved through the process after this body is no longer involved.
Anna, do you have that in the notes too?
Can you have a city attorney here next time?
Well, it sounds like you'll have the definitions next time. The city is just going to grab those definitions. Is that what Grace was saying?
I don't know that it's gonna be, again, I don't want to speak for the city attorney's office. Put it this way, the drafting of the definition is part of, like, even if you do not have specific definitions to consider as part of this recommendation, you will have another opportunity to weigh in as task force members before it is filed with city council.
Could we add that maybe we could reconvene as a task force to meet one more time?
So that's like the heart of what I hear you saying, is that you are hesitant to have this happen after the task force is officially disbanded and no longer needed. And so you're wondering if you can see the terminology.
One more point of
drafted.
engagement for this body.
Grace, how does that, do you have thoughts about that?
What is Chris asking for another meeting? No, I'm just asking to make sure I heard that. I think, Chris,
Yes.
can we let this process play out for another month and see where we're at before we determine if that's necessary? I mean, we're certainly open to it. It's just, I don't want to commit everybody in the room to one or more continuing meetings if it turns out that's not necessary, but we're certainly open to it if it's needed.
The principle, I think, that Chris is saying is not so much he wants another meeting, but he would like the task force to still officially be in place to be able to review the terminology. And if there's any concerns, to reconvene again before they're officially disbanded and sent on their way, that feels a little uncomfortable, at least to him.
Yeah, I
so
understand that. I think, Chris, we're following the pattern that we followed with Energize Denver, where once the ordinance language was in like the city attorney's hands, the task force was no longer meeting, because that process takes more than 2 weeks, right? So, but the task force was then provided the document directly along with the rest of the public, but they did receive it directly. There was significant communication between city staff and the task force members to ensure that their intent was appropriately or accurately reflected in the ordinance itself.
And there may have
again, so
even-
we're just following a pattern that we had that was successful for us before.
And I think at the time there was actually a briefing for the task force and they were allowed, right? Isn't that true?
I think
The
that's,
task force
yes,
had
that's correct.
briefing, they had an opportunity to ask questions and engage. So I think what Chris is saying is sort of consistent, Grace, but I think the main thing for us to note is that at least some people here are really interested in having that be explicit, that there will be a time for the task force to be engaged and see the final recommendations and have a chance to raise.
And if it helps, I can give an example that we've done in excise and licenses. So we did something similar when we updated our marijuana ordinance. We had a marijuana licensing work group that, similar to this task force, talked through what they wanted to see, what new licenses, what they wanted to opt into. And those recommendations were really general. They didn't even give us a report. It was all just recorded and minutes were taken. But, all of that feedback was then given to our city attorneys who drafted the ordinance. And then there was a public there was a window where we did outreach. We did outreach with the work group themselves who met, We did outreach with, the general public, open to anyone. We did online, and all of that was before we ever filed the bill, which then goes through the formal council process for public feedback. So, if that helps to kind of have that model in mind.
Doesn't, because I still feel, and it's the comment that Renee made, that we're basically approving of defining things that are still left undefined. So I know this is something we talked about originally.
Yeah.
This is not a motion of body, but I make a motion that we do not approve these definitions absent some idea of what these definitions could look like.
Well, and Chris, let me just try to reframe and see if this is consistent with what you're saying. I mean, I think what I hear you saying, which makes sense, and I see some nodding, is that you all are fine, I think, giving sort of like, yeah, so far so good. And before this goes to council, we would like to see the language and make sure it's consistent with what we're talking about, make sure it preserves the intent of the original ordinance in the ways that we're talking about, and then be able to, at that point, raise concerns as a task force before there's any public representation that the task force has signed off, and these are consensus recommendations for council. And so I think if we can note that there would, and maybe that will be, for example, sending all the language out to task force members, say, we're gonna have a briefing, let us know if you have concerns and want a meeting. And if anyone says, yeah, I want a meeting, then the group meets before, and then you all can say, no, I'm not in support of this language.
I'm withholding any support of moving ahead defining definitions that personally I feel should have been defined coming into the portion of where we're at by now.
Totally.
4 months in since our first meeting, and to being asked to support the defining of these things as opposed to being presented with proposed definitions of these things, and knowing that the final definition will be something decided long after we're done.
Yeah. Okay.
Takes away an opportunity then for community engagement. And
Yeah.
ultimately a body that's giving credibility to the output of this process.
Okay. So here's what we can totally do. I don't think we need to decide right now what we don't need to, I don't think act on. I think we can note that there are concerns, and there's at least one person who's really not going to be comfortable signing off, being asked to sign off on this without what you're asking for. And I think we'll just go and see. I think there's a lot of probably discussion that needs to happen with the city about involve city's attorney's office and involve people. And I know that they've been super busy with it and not sitting on their heels. So I think it's just, let's come back to this at the next meeting. But I think for now, if it's okay, I think the main thing that we're asking for, are there any concerns at this point? And you all have provided, I think this conversation has probably been instructive in terms of what's happening with the definition parts. Does anyone have does that sound okay for now? And then we'll come back to this in July after the city has had a chance to process a little bit.
I think we should have a city attorney here.
Totally. And we have had some members of the city attorney's office at some of these meetings, but we will check in with them. And Grace, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I assume that Lindsay or somebody has.
We actually just learned, we just learned today that Lindsay is leaving the city, so we're gonna get assigned a new attorney. So we'll definitely
So that may be,
ask them to come to the next meeting.
Well,
that may be why.
having been on the Energized Denver Task Force, the process worked.
Yeah.
It was kind of making sure that and I get where you're coming from about the definition, some of those things that go on. But when we went through and it was we all felt very comfortable seeing what the final recommendation was and having that opportunity to provide feedback before it even went into any more general public conversation, city council team. Because what we didn't want to have happen is, to your point, is that people in the general public are seeing what they think is what, and then we find out that we got changes because something wasn't heard. And so as we went through that process, once then it came out of our task force, that had been totally voted on, vetted, and then it went into public comment, and then it went to city council, and we didn't have any problems with any confusion on the back end.
Yeah. And I think it's almost like you want to just codify that in some way or.
Yeah.
So I get, just trying to get closer to that word implementation.
Yeah.
That's in our title.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think, it's a good flag and it's a fair fear to say, hey, what we're not doing is a blank check to go define things however you want without it, right? But my understanding of the recommendation is the ordinance should include definitions, but it doesn't currently. or we don't recommend that, because it's not really. So the recommendation itself, I think, is saying, yeah, these things should be defined. Now, the critical piece of implementation is defining these so that staff can decide how to do it. But I think sending a strong message that that is not a blank check to just go define things however you want. We want another touch point on the definition, but not earlier you were, no, we're not making motions, we're making a motion to not support this. And I think, I think we as a task force can, my read is we can still support, things should be defined. We just also want to make it clear that's not a blank.
Yeah.
Check on the definition and we want to touch
One another.
on the definition.
So maybe what we can do then is modify the recommendation form to include language that these definitions should, I guess we all thought it was kind of a given, right? But being explicit about it, right? The definition should be in line with the legislative intent.
Yeah.
There's that. And then everyone, I just also dropped into the chat the section of the municipal code that already exists where trash is regulated, and it has a number of terms already defined. And I think this is the intent of this recommendation, is to say that where terms are already defined in city code, that this ordinance should also reference those same terms. And we obviously will have to get into affected premise and just see, we'll explore where else that may be defined in the code, in the city's code in general, to make sure that it's aligned with the intent of this ordinance.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I think the bottom line too, I think another bottom line is that city staff are very, very, very committed to this task force being able to stand up in front of council and say, we support this, we are champions, right? So they're not interested, there's no interest in going around you guys. It's baked in. Okay, with that, are we good to move on? Okay, thanks. I think this is a healthy conversation, it's a good conversation. Blake, I think you were gonna go into the next set.
Yeah, I thought I had the hard part, but I don't.
No, it's been the
No. Yes.
real.
Yeah, so we're gonna shift into really, I think, the meat and potatoes. I'll put down because you guys will see. The meat and potatoes, I think of the from a compliance perspective, from a phasing perspective. And so we're gonna be talking about residential buildings and non-residential buildings. So first, residential. So what we've been hearing, I think, throughout this process is obviously when the ordinance was written originally, the timing is not syncing with the reality of where we are today. We touched upon that earlier with other aspects of construction and demolition, that being effective now, right? So there was always this need to reassess on timing. But through discussion, we've also been hearing from task force members and in the working groups, the recommendation to essentially start the phasing 1 year from when legislation is enacted, whenever that is. And then the subsequent sort of medium and small level of compliant entities would kick in 2 years and then 3 years. So 12, 24, and 36 months respectively. Again, these are things that we've been hearing that there's been general support for, but we're here to create space to talk those through. In addition, this allows the task force time to deliberate without having to continually revise the recommendation. And so this is a big one because, again, this covers the vast majority of the entities that would be covered under Waste No More, residential buildings, and then we're going to talk about non-residential. Going through the equity lens, this doesn't directly impact equity on a relative basis. What it does is it indirectly provides more time for entities to comply. So in that sense, that is the equity lens going through the rubric and the scoring. And then lastly, what we've heard for residential buildings that we've, and this is a typo, so I'm going to clarify this. We have not reached consensus on the timing. That's what we're hoping to do through this process. But what I would say we're close to consensus on or agreement is that there be 3 tiers. Large being the first to comply, medium, and then small to follow. That has been generally agreed to and also is reflective of how the original ordinance was written. There are 3 tiers for residential buildings. The last piece on residential is that there was support for tweaks to be made by City and County of Denver staff on the numerical thresholds. Not to an extent where it would deviate largely away from how the intent of the original ordinance was written, but in a way where it is more consistent, again, with like how Erica was framing it, of efficiency of the process, how existing buildings are inspected and brought into compliance. Yeah, we want to talk about this. We've created, I just want to say before we get into it, we have created a lot of time for these two because these are big ones. So yes, Chris.
I've heard this now twice, but we've heard. The work groups that I was in, I remember there were certain times where we were encouraged not to go into specifics. Because can you share what work group came up with the specific recommendations of 12, 24, and 36? Who was on that work group? Was it staff, city, was it a talkback group, or was it very representative, let's say, a larger task force? The next question comes to the implementation date. You know, I'm just doing a little back and napkin math, but if the original implementation date on the first ordinance that the original signature gathering occurred had been amended or updated to the actual election it occurred in, we would be implementing by today. So to say and change that significantly from established rulemaking or established passage by the people to established 1 year after city council had finished its process, which it best could be next January, seems to be out of line or out of step with originators' intent.
So Chris, before is the response to that, so the two things I'm hearing from you is one, just a concern about like that this doesn't feel totally consistent with the conversations you were.
No, just trying to figure out where we were working on.
The 36 comes from the ordinance we wrote.
Yeah.
We just didn't use months, we used days.
Yeah, so that was,
1 year, 2 years, 3 years, so that's consistent with the ordinance.
Yeah.
and then the second
I agree,
question is,
backing them up, it's a year
Yeah.
and a half after voters.
feels like too much.
Feels
time.
like it was gonna be. You're already hearing people calling day one, saying they want to implement it in their buildings.
Yeah. So the question,
It's a year and a half delay.
Yeah. So it's,
I just want to see that.
and in terms of petitioners, in terms of you, Chris, your original question, it sounds like the concern is this waiting too long to start requiring the first tier?
Yeah, and I can kind of speak to that.
Yeah.
Because this came up in working groups that I sat in, and I think, right, there was the challenge is, right, if we set a date, we don't know how long the legislative process will take. And the concern is that for people who have to implement, right, business owners, property owners, things like that, they're not going to know what the finalized requirements are until city council passes the bill. And so they need time to know, you know, they know what the ordinance as passed says, but if anything changes, right, that's up to the task force. They would want to have time once they know what's final, right? So that's why it shifted to 12 months post passage of city council. And we had thought about making that, right, you know, people had talked about, let's make it pretty quick, because is the legislative intent to get it done by X year certain, or is it to do it within a reasonable time frame, right? And so with the uncertainty of the process, what I heard from folks say was that because people need to know what the final requirements are going to be, because they're going to want to know who's defined, right, things like that, a year felt kind of equitable for, you know, keeping it on a pace with in line with the ordinance at the 1, 2, 3 years, right, in a set time certain, while still giving them that ability to know, like, all right, the process is done. It's not currently being considered by a task force. So, I mean, if you all feel like that's too much time, we can reduce it, right? And that's, I think, where we are.
And one question I have, just based on a couple of the comments that you all that had passed, is I don't know if it's a black or white thing. My one question is, are there things that can be done in the meantime? And Ian and I talked about this briefly, but that low hanging fruit, other things that can be happening in that year, as opposed to just pushing everything out and telling people they don't have to do anything.
And that's a good point, right? Because any task force reports for like supports and incentive programs, that's something that CAFR can do without a city council ordinance, right? So that's stuff they can start working on, but this is kind of the last date to come into compliance. People can come into compliance sooner. So Ian, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, I guess my question is, you're saying things may change. I mean, they'll have to provide recycling and composting. Pretty, you know, maybe the compliance of like the form changes or something. If the number of units stays the same, what is really the uncertainty other than just the timeline sheet of having to provide it.
I've just been called by a lot of businesses over the years that say I didn't have enough time to comply, so I was a little bit more conservative on that, right? That could be my own
And-
personal view, but like I said, if this group, feels that 6 months, 18 months, and whatever 12 or 30 months is a more appropriate timeline, given the ordinance intent, this is just a starting point.
Christie.
From my perspective, having started this process 3 years ago now, we started writing it, I think, or close to it. I think the largest entities knew it was coming for them, so this idea that they didn't know it was coming for over 75 units. But it seems a little moot to me.
Okay, which point I'll take in.
The addition, my understanding, reading through the recommendations and from being part of this process is that the idea is for year one, whenever that starts, to be more of an education and, onboarding year and enforcement compliance acquisition, whatever we're calling it, won't come until a couple of years later anyway, and we'll be figuring that out. So like, what would be the harm in starting, say, 2 months after it's passed by city council? I mean, how long does it take for the city to send out letters to everyone affected? Anna and folks who have reached out to us, even who we've referred to Anna, have already all been informed, as she mentioned, about the CFP requirement. So yeah, a whole year, unless y'all are trying to line it up with EPR and kind of delay the city implementation until we know what's happening statewide and how EPR is affecting this, then I guess that's a different conversation. That was my assumption. That's why we're pushing it back with so much.
So I think we should have, there are probably more people who want to speak. I see a couple of hands, but I will also say that we should, give ourselves a time limit here for the discussion. I know that and then decide what it is that we need to do. Do we need to go send this back to a work group? We've had a lot of discussion about phasing and rollout. So we've heard from all of you. We know that what's being voiced here, I think, is an important question about this year. And we all have a lot of information about each other's interests. So I think if we can put some creative hats on and think about if there's ways to thread the needle. But first of all, Renee, and I think Councilman Hines and maybe Anna, you all had your hands up.
Could I just make one
Yeah.
quick comment just to frame it? I think there is a dichotomy of what we're hearing. So we want it to be, and when I'm saying we, I'm sort of projecting, but the task force, members of the task force would like it to be consistent with the original timeline and intent. But we've also been hearing from the actual covered entities that they would like more time to comply. So I think this is.
Of course. We've
Yeah.
also heard from residents that they would like less time to comply.
There are always residents. We've been getting calls for years.
Yeah.
That's why I'm in this, and then they want that done, but there are other residents that don't want. it.
That was the
And
intent.
that's so,
Was the intent
and there are
12
a lot more
months
residents that don't want it than do.
Like,
So a reminder that it's hard for the people online to hear if there's multiple conversations, but I think duly noted, there's a lot of that's why we're all here, because everyone's coming with a different hat. Any other, I want to go to.
Ryan, there's
Yeah,
also a hand virtually, just so you know.
Can we do this? Did you have more you wanted to say before I go to?
No, again, I just wanted to highlight that there are different perspectives on it.
Yeah.
And this is not.
Yeah.
Hazard, producing, this is what we've been hearing.
Yeah. Totally. So Renee, Councilman Hines, Anna, you might have been first, and whoever, and then the online, we have at least one comment. Whoever of you, the three of you was first, I'm not sure.
So I have two thoughts. One is that through some of our equity conversation, there's been some discussion, and it might be coming in future slides about waivers or sentence or things like that. So that might help in overlapping that with this. Understanding that if there are people who are negatively impacted by the 12, 24, 36, there might be a way to pull this together. Second thought is maybe a 6-month grace period, right? And so maybe we do move it up to being 6, 18, and 30, and have a 6-month grace period where it's just, kind of different levels of compliance. And I don't know how complicated that is from an enforcement standpoint, but those are the two things.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great. Anna.
Really similar to that was if we move, my gut is that the intent was to have it be started next in 2024. And by pushing it another 12 months, I'm not it sounds like Catherine might have some ideas on education and what's gonna happen, so. If we're gonna delay it 12 months, I'd wanna know exactly what was gonna happen in that 12 months, and that we're not just kicking it down the road. And so I would be in favor of moving it up into that 6 to 18 and then having a clear exemption or the support that these people need to build more enclosures or, you know, find space.
Great. Thank you. And then Councilman Hines, and then we'll do online, and then we'll just take all this and do some reflection.
Do we have a recommendation and timeline? And I'm now admitting that I haven't looked at the slides in advance. But a recommendation timeline for outreach. To Ian's point, people should have known. But we're the city and we should make sure that people are actually informed using a city process. And I wonder if that timeline, if we don't already have the recommendation, the outreach timeline, if that could be expeditious.
Yeah.
And then the enforcement is when it is.
Yep. And instead of making that a question, can we just note that, come back to it as this is might be something that, in line with what Anna and Renee are saying, could be an alternate like amendment to this idea. Yeah. Okay. We'll come back. Yeah. Sonia.
Thank you. Yeah,
Sonia,
sorry.
yeah.
Thank you. So just to add to the conversation, this is Sonia Riggs with the Colorado Restaurant Association. My understanding is right now we're specifically talking about recommendation number 3 with the 12, 24, and 36 months. But my concern is that whatever we decide on this, I assume that all of the other stakeholders that are going to need to comply at some point, or we're going to want to have some sort of consistency. And maybe it's that I don't understand how many residential buildings per se are actually out there. Are we talking about, 100 or 1,000? And that may make a difference. But, looking at these future stakeholder groups, I'm concerned that if we move it too quickly, we're going to fail. And I think it's going to be really, really important that when we start rolling this out, we do it in the right way to make sure that we do have plenty of time for education, right? And I know we're going to talk about this at some point coming up, that this is actually realistic, that people can comply. I mean, just in talking to the restaurants that I've spoken to, out of like 5 of them, 4 of them have been dropped from composting and recycling because there was not capacity from their providers. So I know that's going to have to come to be part of the conversation. My concern is if we're trying to move things too quickly, are we going to set ourselves up for failure? That's all I want us to consider. Everybody's points make sense, but I just want to make sure that whatever we do, the program that we're going to do is successful.
Great. And I think there might be another online comment or two, but just to say, so far, what I'm hearing is very consistent with what I heard really at the first meeting when we talked about what are everyone's interests. And it was everything from, we want to make sure this was passed by the voters and we want to make sure it's implemented in line with that. And we want it to be successful. We want it to be really successful. And so we want to be nuanced and thoughtful and realistic. And so when you all speak about waivers, or grace periods or incentives or whatever, I think that's kind of what you're trying to get at, is how to do both. So,
and we do have space and time planned later in today's session to talk way more in detail on compliance and phasing. Again, this aspect is to respond directly to these recommendations, and this is helpful for us to hear that there is still some disagreement, but please.
Well, so Ian and then Stephen and then Ian, and then were there any online still that we're good? Okay.
There's one online comment that we can say after at the end.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that.
This is a response for Renee, what you were, it's already written in the order. You already
said
that there was an exemption for people who were struggling in the process. And I think from our perspective, the large entities are covered now. And so now we're gonna kick it 1.5 years for that. That just doesn't seem in line with what people want. And some say that again.
Thank you.
So I have one clarification question. Sorry, I missed the last meeting, but we're saying that recycling and composting are implemented at the same time.
I think we were looking at it, residential buildings and then non-residential buildings, and then
The recycling, I don't think is like, speaking for my members, and I know we're not on residential, but I think you probably agree, composting is going to be the more challenging piece. Because in ours, we have talked about separating those two out, having composting lag a period behind the actual recycling. And the way I read this is the compliance date is 12 months after. That means 12 months after it's approved is when you have to be in compliance.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing it as they have. Like. So basically what it sounded like, well, in 1 year, they have to start doing all of this. I'm reading it as that by that first year, they have to start doing it.
Yeah, and that's kind of where, what Blake was mentioning earlier, right? Like, if you want to start 1 month after the ordinance, you can, right? The 12, 24, 36 are meant to be like think of the people that, the city can communicate, the city can do outreach. There's always going to be left, there's going to be smaller operators, there's going to be operators in communities that, don't trust the city, don't trust information from the city, right? And so it's kind of, that's the last day, right?
That's the way you read
Not the first day.
Yeah.
Right, so it would be in effect immediately, but you have 12 months in that group.
Before you would start receiving any kind of penalties and those kinds of things is the way I was reading it.
Right, and so, I just want to make that clarification, but I also hear everyone else's point that, they feel that urgency is important too. So I think, knowing that these dates are kind of the last date for that group, does it still feel too long, or does it?
That's what I was trying to get to was if that's if from the time that it passes, 12 months later, you have to be in compliance versus making it sound like that it's a.
Yeah, it's not that
You know what I
it
mean?
starts in a year,
that
it's
you need
the
to
day
start
that
planning
ordinance
right now.
passes, right? If you're in that first group, you now have 365 days total for you have to comply, right? That's the drop dead date, but you could start next month if you knew it was coming and you're prepared and you want to be competitive, right? You want to be one of the first adopters, that's not precluded. Right?
Because I feel like the problem with the reason you need some of that time is back to the point of the hardship. How do you give the city time during that first 12-month period to rectify and all of those things so that by the end of the 12 months, you understand who should be in compliance and then who's been approved for hardship so that at that 12-month deadline, everybody knows where they're supposed to be. That's the way I'm kind of reading it. And is that kind of the intent that you had is that,
Well, I think that,
because that's going to take a lot of staff time to go through all of that process. So
I think that was kind of the conversation that we had prior to this about where the compromise was just about enforcement. Because it's already in effect now, so I guess maybe I'm not alone in misunderstanding that you were talking about effective date versus compliance. I think.
the
So
compliance.
does that mean, does that mean if somebody gets the hardship, it could be like 2 years from January before they would have to be in compliance?
Based on how it's set up in the recommendations right now, yes, that'd be correct.
So Christy, I actually saw Chris's hand up earlier and then Christy, and I think there's an online comment. What I would encourage us, and you all may be about to speak to this, but what I'm hearing is that we're reiterating that there's a lot of interest here, right? And we're trying to, what this exercise is how can we meet all these interests in a way that you all can support? And remember that we need all of your support in order for this to get a thumbs up from council. We need, we need the support of this group. So it requires some creative thinking of all of us.
Well, I just heard a conflict of terms.
Yeah, exactly. And so
Compliance versus effective.
Exactly. And so
Maybe that's where the balance. That's where,
Exactly.
I mean, my members are recycling.
Right. No, I
Right,
think.
but I mean, point being is that the effective date versus the
Yes,
compliance date,
exactly.
I think those are two totally different
Exactly.
conversations.
And that may be one of the places of creative thinking about how to thread this particular needle, but I'm going to pause that, hear from Chris and I think Christy, and then see what other online.
Yeah, that's a game changer. So this doesn't preclude early adopters from getting after it.
Right.
And for them to even pilot program, the kickoff and to show how it can work and how it can benefit people. So some people are gonna come out of the gates pretty fast, not, and it's gonna be really important that they're successful.
And rewarded, ideally.
Yeah.
Okay. Christy.
Yeah. The representative from the Colorado Restaurant Association, Sonia, I have meant to address this comment before. I've heard it echoed a few times. there is plenty of space in the market among organic only haulers to take restaurants. We have hundreds of restaurants. I know my competitors and peers have hundreds of restaurants. When GFL bought Alpine, they were a little discombobulated, lost their contract with Waste Management, stopped hauling compost, and a lot of folks fell through the cracks. Hundreds reached out to us and other haulers. It sounds like some of these restaurants didn't. Maybe that's a marketing failure on our part, or maybe it's just they decided we don't have to yet, we don't want to. The market demand will help our businesses grow. I would venture to say, with all due respect to Chris and others, that there are the haulers that are doing organics only. We are ready to provide this service, provide service for your members. We're members of both of these associations. We've got an email from Jen. We're about to join this one. That's what this ordinance is designed to do. So that kind of pushback to me just sounds counter to this.
Well, and I think that's great to clarify, just in case there's a part of all this. Thank you. All right, Councilman Hines, and then we'll go.
Sorry, since the compliance or effective is kind of up in the air. I know that with our landlord registry, which is a huge thing, we have been very, it took effect at the beginning of the year. We've been very lenient about fines for people who should have been registered at the beginning of the year. Maybe when we're considering what compliance or effective or whatever it is, we should also be prescriptive, or at least, provide strong guidance on when we expect compliance to actually happen. Because we're just barely starting to find some of the worst offenders with the landlord registry 6 months after they were supposed to have already been harmed.
Got it. And this will tie in, I mean, we will bring this to some closure at some point, but then it will tie into a conversation we're having right after this, which is, well, what compliance makes, what enforcement mechanisms make sense in light of how we're setting this up to satisfy all these, concurrent interests that we have. Yeah.
One last thing, we have landlords in District 10 who have no interest, will never come into compliance unless they're fined.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's important that we have the carrot and we encourage and have outreach and communication. Have to have the stick.
So if I can hop in here, just based on everything that everyone said, would people feel better? Right, I'm thinking that maybe in the summary where we say to start 12, 24, 36 months respectively, is that maybe what's throwing people on the word start, right?
Yeah.
Because to your point, like by 12, 24, 36. So maybe that's a really simple tweak we can make to the recommendation form, not simple, but a very pointed change that we can make to this recommendation. And I'm going to throw it out there the next one too. That way it's clear that that's the last date for that group to comply, not the first date.
Because I read it that it's effective from the time the city council approves it.
Right.
And then based on your size, you have 12, 24, 36 months to come into.
Is that
That's the way I'm reading.
Is what Stephen's saying consistent with what you all are saying?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I think that was the idea, and it might just be how the recommendation is currently worded. And so if we update it to that, it sounds like that's much more what everyone else was hoping.
Well, and the other thing I'm hearing, and I know there are online comments too, is how to, even if that is the case, which helps some heartburn, are there ways to talk about early adoption, pilot programs, incentives to look at that first year and capture the low hanging fruit and get people into compliance as quickly as possible through that too?
Now, what I've heard from these
Go ahead.
meetings
Yeah.
is that many of us recognize that a lot of first adoption has already occurred. I've heard recently that one segment of this table could possibly be already seeing well over 80% voluntary participation. And so one of the things I remember hearing early on was conversations about, could we look at incentives? Could we look at embracing people that are already implementing programs, so that instead of seeking out creating test cases for best practice, realize we already have best practice in action, and whether or not resources, peer development, plugging in to find solutions, finding partners like I did with the building behind me, so I could get ahead of this years before you're telling me I had to. That we're missing that part. And I remember hearing very clearly, and felt like it's happened, been said a couple times, that we almost have this big gap of a lack of information about how much compliance is actually already occurring. We could very well be shocked by it. And some incentives then could get us to goals meaningful impact sooner, long before compliance is the tool that gets us to our.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for you to see our compliance tools applied because that's.
Well, and
You said it better than I could, so thank you.
totally, and there's also a recommendation on financial supports and incentives, and I think one in the works for exemptions, waivers, grace periods as well. Online comments, I think we.
So the only comment I have is from Allison. Buildings also need to have the final ordinance with the education and signage pieces before we can purchase bins, etc. For large facilities, 6 months is not reasonable.
So the signage piece is also going to be part of this, and that's a recommendation that we're going to probably start to see, or see in July. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, to be honest, when you talk about the resident, and we can, this will take care of the conversation when we talk about non-residents at the same time. You're talking about, you know, granted, there's a lot of people that are saying, hey, my apartment buildings aren't doing this. But there's obviously people that aren't kind of aware of it. And so how do we educate? I just heard, you know, you're going into one of your buildings that talk about to the janitorial team to do a training tomorrow night. And so I think having that training with the tenants, once the signage is there and all of that, there needs to be, which is why I like the idea of the compliance versus, in other words.
Enforcement.
No, effective date.
Yeah.
That if the effective date for everyone is kind of on this date. So that goes to me, that kind of gives you a little bit more to what the voters were wanting this to be implemented right away. So the effective date is that. But we're saying that you have this much time to come into compliance before we're gonna fine you.
Yeah.
Because the city needs time to look. So I think that works on both residential and non-residential. So I'm just putting that out there so we don't have to have the conversation twice.
Okay.
So it sounds like you guys are ready to talk about the next one. And it, well, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But it sounds like this group feels that changing that last day rather than start addresses the concerns that some people can do it sooner. Most people are already doing it. We can talk about more of the incentivized best practices in action when it comes to like our compliance toolkit. But does that change anyone's mind on the 12, 24, and 36, knowing that that's the last date?
Well, and before like answering that, I would just say that we are about to have a conversation on not just on financial supports and incentives, but also these other things that may be part of that package. So I don't think you need to absolutely answer that for sure right now, but I think we want at the end of this meeting to have a sense of like, are people comfortable with this package approach going forward? Because I feel like it might be hard for some people to answer that question without talking about enforcement.
I mean, if you all can, right?
Yeah, totally.
That's great. I think that's right.
So let me go first. Ian, who had his hand up. I feel like Chris, I want to see if there's anyone else who wants to speak, and then we'll come back to you for sure. Ian and Mark, can we go to Marguerite first and then come back to you and then Ryan? Okay.
I just kind of feel like the effective date is like a null term because before the ordinance existed, building could recycle and compost. Like that's always existed. So the point of the ordinance is to keep it in compliance. So I just think, I don't know if that's really like the saving grace of this recommendation to me.
So in answer to Eric's question, changing it from the start date to the effective date.
I mean, you can change the language.
Or that
comply
to be able to comply. The sort of the drop dead deadline.
Right.
Yeah, that doesn't totally do it.
That's my opinion. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And Marguerite, it would be helpful after we hear from other people if you can think about like what, okay, if not that, what would help you get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a shorter timeline. I think 36 months is like, no one needs to prepare for that long. Like, this is not a new technology. The markets don't need to, like, I just think 36 months is so far away. I don't know. I was writing down the month, maybe 12, 18, 24. But yeah.
So I hear some support for that. So it's not so much the first deadline for you right now, but Covington Hartford is the last.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Others, Ryan.
Yeah, I had 2 points. One, Dan texted me, he's having audio problems, so he asked me to mention a concern that there hasn't been a specific composting working group, because there are obvious challenges in enforcing the compost piece in particular. That you'd like the composter to meet up and just discuss the realities of bottlenecks. So that's from Dan. The other point I wanted to make is just to zoom out and first of all, I think it'd be good to visualize the timeline to lay it out. But I wanted to mention what's in the original ordinance language intended for the 2021 election in November 2021. The effective date would be June 1st, 2022, which is essentially 7 months after voters decided. If we move that to when the election actually took place, that would be right now. So just wanted to share that.
And do you have any thoughts on Erica's question and sort of, you know, with Marguerite provided her sense? I mean, it sounds like you're saying you're kind of on the side of like, let's speed it up, given the original intent, but how does this sort of general approach sound to you? In light of that.
Personally, I think it'd be cool to visualize the timeline,
Okay.
and lay it out, have the different
Okay.
affected entities,
Yep.
and really define that term. Like it sounds like there's a lot of misunderstanding on effective date, defined date,
Yeah.
et cetera.
And yeah.
Really keep in mind what the voters want.
Okay, thank you. That's great. But a visual timeline would be helpful. It sounds like. Okay, so I see 3 hands and.
Brian,
you
I have
wanna
2
go-
comments online as well.
Oh, good. So how about if we do these 3 hands and then we'll go to the 2 comments and then we'll sort of assess where we are.
I appreciate and like the change to buy and support, appreciate that. Like Marguerite's suggested, maybe 12, 18, 24, or maybe even a suggestion of taking pre implementations to 2, 12 and 24. But try to accelerate that last group.
Since they're saying, one of the concerns there, I think we would need to have conversation around equity.
Yeah,
So just making sure that.
thank you. Okay, yeah, Chrissy.
Along the lines of Brian's comment, I would love to also see this sort of, diagrams with the backdrop of the city's climate goals and how waste diversion figures into it. And maybe, I don't know if I've missed this, but if we could see like an inventory of how many buildings, businesses, et cetera, would be affected along the suggested timeline that we come up with to see like, okay, what are we actually talking about? How many hundreds, thousands of buildings, estimated tons of material and recycling and composting translates to meeting the other climate and waste diversion targets that this all ties into.
This is Grace. Can I chime in one time before I have to go?
Oh,
just about
yeah,
that.
great.
That is that's actually one of our big conundrums is that we do not have one single database of all the buildings that would be covered by this ordinance. So luckily in our office, we have the Energized Denver building benchmarking requirement. So now we have data on buildings that are pretty good list of buildings, 5,000 square feet and up, but we are missing the list of buildings that are 8 units and up that don't meet that threshold, like residential buildings. So yeah, we definitely want that, but we do not have that. We will not be able to produce that for you for quite some time.
So essentially, we don't know how many family buildings of different sizes we have.
We don't. And that's where the residential licensing program comes in, which will be really helpful. But again, we don't have full compliance on that yet either. So all of these city processes will work together eventually.
That estimate is around 50,000.
50,000 estimate. Grace, before we lose you, do you want to say anything about, we have a couple hands up, I'm going to get to people, but is there anything you want to chime in on here other than that?
Oh, no, I mean, this is exactly where we needed to be at this point. It's a really in-depth discussion and I'm so sorry that I'm in a different time zone and I have to go. So
thanks for being here for the time that you were. Okay, there were other hands up, I think. Renee,
it's a bit of just that word setting. Thing of once the ordinance is in effect, you have 90 days to comply. The grace period could be the 12/24 release, or something. Actually, really very requested a lot for things, but or just or it could be that the semantics are what goes to account you're responsible for bringing your system. But labeling it a grace period.
Just for terminology, just for vernacular, right, grace period is more of like an enforcement kind of topic, and we can talk about that, I think, a little bit more in our small groups that we'll get into, but I'm hearing a lot of the, like, Grace meant, or like Ryan mentioned, right, it's the 36 months, more than the 12 months that's giving a lot of people heartburn, because that feels like a long time. So if we make 2 changes, right, it sounds like this group is leaning toward 2 changes, right? That drop dead date, not that start date, so changing that. And then kind of reducing the timeline from a 3-year, which is what the original ordinance called for, but because we've gone into that timeline, reducing it to maybe something like 12, 18, 24. Those 6 months between groups rather than 12 months between groups.
And the other thing I'm hearing also so far is some interest within that first year of not encouraging people to wait to the end of the first year, but actually both if there's a way in the language of the ordinance to actually frame it that this is in effect, you're expected to do this now, and then work on incentive, rewards, etc., so that there's as much early adoption as possible. So with that, is that so far sounding better? Does anyone have any like big other red flags that we haven't just captured? Okay, I see a couple hands, and then we're gonna do the online ones. Margaret, can we go to you and then Peggy?
Sure, and mine's quick. Just, I agree with all of that. I think that is progress. I think this point to like justifications and the research behind, I just spitballed 12, 18, 24. And like, how does that line up? Research, the reason, like the equity component to that, I think just would be.
Yeah, so actually have it be analyzed.
Yeah.
And have it be analyzed with, to Stephen's point too.
That was one of my points.
And the equity lens. So you're asking for that to go back and be analyzed again. So I'm gonna just do a quick round robin. Chris, do you have a quick thing?
Yeah, I agree with thinking the timeline, but I think our talk about exemptions or exceptions is coming up.
Yeah.
Because, obviously, if there's no space in a facility for these extra bins, or then, and they can't make the timeline, if the industry, everyone, 50,000 buildings, how many containers is that? How many trucks is that? And how are we gonna be able to meet that requirement? So just want to make sure that that lens is also
Still there. And I think that part is very much still coming and is part of this big picture. And a lot of people talk about just not letting that acceptance follow the whole. Can we do I'm gonna go to Peggy because she's had her hand up for a while, and then we'll come to others as well. And Maurice.
Totally on board with what you said, Marguerite, that, having that shorter, maybe 24 max is really the right place to be. I do think that 3 tiers is where we need to be, not just 2. I think there's just too much gap between 500 unit apartment community that's owned by institutionally versus an 8 unit that's some guy's personal income and that's how to put food on the table. So we do have to make allowances and recognize that those differences. But Stephen, you probably speak to this if needed, but I think for the benchmarking for Energize Denver has a compliance date each year for the reporting, let's say June 1, and says if you are not in compliance or to report, you have penalties begin 8 months. So we can maybe have whatever we need to bring the dates closer in, but make allowances for the equity reasons that there's ways that we can achieve that are still reasonable and people are already familiar. We're trying to, dovetail into programs already in place. They're already going to be familiar with that feeling, and we can just piggyback on that. So they, it's not yet another set of standards to try and remember who's doing what. And, I just want to recognize what Ian's saying is that, the intent of the voters and trying to honor what that is, maybe we can keep those dates and still allow for the equity piece based on these start dates. But then also, like you said, I thought it was a really good point that we can be doing things in the meantime. So it's not like we're just sitting on our hands for the first 12 months, waiting for people to, become compliant, but we can do the educational piece and we can have it out there. So there's a sense of forward movement, acknowledgement that this program is out there and we are moving on it.
Yeah.
So I just kind of bring up a lot
Yeah.
about what we talk about. Those are just.
Thank you. And so I'm going to try to wrap us up on this piece in the next 2 minutes and then see where we are. So who else? Councilman Hines and Luis. Thank you.
She talked about the educational piece. I just want to again plug that I think that we should have on the timeline.
Yeah.
The education and outreach.
Yep.
And we've voted on contracts in the past with vendors and we've said we're going to do education, not one or agency that's represented here. I'm thinking of in particular, we voted on contracts 2 years ago. We said we're going to do education, we still haven't.
Yeah.
So
when we do that timeline, have it there, and also the signage communication education group, please remember all this conversation. We'll document it for you. You'll have it in your conversation. Luis.
Yeah, from my end as always, the education piece, the impact on workers, 30 hours for janitors to become green, right? I mean, Denver, at least from the non-residential ones, we have probably close to 400, 500 buildings that we're in, right? So, I mean, I want to add that to what Chris said, right? Like put that timeline in, because it's gonna require since day one that to educate folks.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, on the building management side, sometimes, you get educated, but the trash cans are not there. At the end, they all put the same things on the same load, right? So there are other things that also is out of the purview of the janitors that have to come also from the building management. So I mean, it's education to both, with building owners, building managers.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
tenants. Yeah.
So I had one more.
Okay. Stephen, very quickly.
It's very quick. I think we need to make sure that the staff, when we, part of this challenge is coming down, how is the staff going to be able to handle all of the
City staff.
The city staff being able to handle, in that 12-month period, all of the waivers and stuff like that. So that's the other piece. I think part of the timeline is how you all can effectively handle.
Okay.
I don't know which department that lies.
Okay, so I mean, I think we've captured a lot of what you all are saying in terms of suggested edit, tweak, refinements to this proposal. I don't know that I need to repeat all of it, but does anyone, I mean, I sort of did a minute ago, capture what I have heard so far. I think, Erica has too. Is there anything that you all feel has not been captured that's giving you heartburn before we sort of make an agreement to go and build this in as much as possible? And I think specifically it's the, looking towards the 12, 18, 24 timeline, the focusing on as much early adoption as possible through education and incentives, thinking hard about the enforcement piece. And then a number of things about the idea of the timeline for next time, so you all can see this all together. I think also, looking at grace periods, focusing on the equity lens as we go back to this, and the focus on this being the drop dead deadline as opposed to the start. Yeah, what else?
A question around measure of success,
Yeah,
because we can roughly estimate how much the volume of trash that we produce. We have a decent idea of what portion is what. How do we find out how many buildings are voluntarily compliant? How do we talk about residential? That's being offered by the city.
You're gonna love our second portion of this.
Do you have some good data on that?
We're gonna be talking about how we're gonna be going
That
about
really
it.
shows us where we are already and really what the gap between 85% compliance, which fundamentally change our waste stream in the city versus 100 and where we are
this
today.
is right. It's a connected conversation.
Yeah, we're gonna go into detail later about best practices and strategies for understanding how well we're doing.
That's 63 minutes at a break, so.
Yeah, so we are obviously have spent a lot more time even on these hard ones than but this is good because this is the heart of it. Checking back in with you guys, where do you?
We do need to cover, did we move the slide ahead for non-residential?
We talked a lot about recommendation number 3, but I think all of the same comments apply to 4 because they're kind of the same as the first 2.
Yes.
So I think we can go to the break.
Well, we've got also the financial incentives one, and I'm wondering, can we do that really quick, just so people have a sense of that recommendation? We can always come back to it in July. I feel like the annual diversion plan is maybe, we don't need to cover it today necessarily.
I mean, I think we can, I think folks are really, well, we'll leave it to you guys. I think if we can take a break and jump into the compliance discussion, we can revisit these two recommendations.
Yeah.
It does feel like that's most germane to where the head.
Okay.
Face of that is, take a break and.
Okay, sounds good. So do you guys, hopefully everyone saw in your packet are two additional recommendations that we didn't just cover. One is on financial incentives and support, and it goes partly to this conversation we just had. And then the other is on the annual diversion plan, which I think we've talked about. It's pretty straightforward. So I think please look at those and we'll cover them next month, but please send the team here any comments, because we asked you all to do this. I know it's a big commitment, but it helps so much if we have a sense of like, here are the hot button issues that are coming up for me, because then the staff can be thinking about that and thinking about some creative alternatives. So please do look at those before the next meeting and send comments. Does that sound good? So we're going to take a break till 4. Then we're going to come back and we're going to segue into enforcement compliance. Online people, thank you for your patience. And we're going to look at your comments now and capture them when we come back if we need to, in terms of additional comments to this conversation, and then we'll go from there. Good? Okay, see you guys back at 4. 6 minutes. Okay. So Louise. Oh, you're where you were. Chris. All right. So folks online, thanks for bearing with us. We're just reconvening. And I just want to thank everyone for bearing with us for this conversation. I think that, you know, it's these processes are iterative. So we had sort of an abstract conversation in our first meeting. We went into small groups. We did a lot of brainstorming. The staff and the work groups worked really hard to come up with recommendations. And once you have recommendations, it starts getting real. And so I feel like this conversation was really focused on, you know, everyone getting really focused on, okay, what does this mean? And I think it did take time to get really concrete input. So thank you. Do you all want to say anything, staff, in terms of final reflections before we just dive into this? Okay.
I just think in general, this is exactly what we're aiming to do today, is to provide space for the whole task force to come together and discuss these things. Because again, there have been somewhat separate conversations for working groups. And so that's the goal. And I just want to commend everybody for speaking so directly and candidly about your concerns. Thank you.
Totally. Thank you. Okay. So knowing that these things are really connected and that it's sort of a package deal, like it's easier to get on board with what the requirements are if you know how it's going to be, what compliance actually means and how it's going to be enforced. And that's where you're weighing in now. So passing it to Blake, and yeah, go ahead.
All right, the fun part, I think, is you know, we've been getting a lot of questions throughout this process about, you know, really what is universal access? What is the real intent of this ordinance, and how do other cities that have universal requirements for recycling and composting think about access? And so what we're going to do today is just kind of walk through sort of the general principles within the zero waste industry and best practices elsewhere, you know, how start to conceptualize these things that are kind of, you know, abstract. So typically, you know, I think the easiest way to really think about access, you know, again, this is the perspective of the ordinance, is it's all about containers, signage, and service, right? So if you're providing all of those things on your premise or at your special event, you would be providing access. And so, access to what? Well, access to recycling containers, to composting containers, different schemes. Perhaps there's an alternative strategy to recycling and composting. It might be your business is completely reusable. And you don't have waste. Bravo, right? Would you need access at that point? You might not. You might have a different type of access. So, we're going to walk through a couple examples in a second just to visualize this and how actually, how difficult it is to define discretely. But before I move on, I want to just highlight that there is a lot of concern that we're hearing about, how does performance play into this? And I think it'll be helpful for us to separate performance from the ordinance and what this task force is trying to do. Yes, the intent is we want everybody to have access, we want them to recycle and compost, and we want that material to flow to the correct places, right? To the highest and best use. Recycling facility rather than a landfill. We'll get to that. The ordinance is specific to providing access. And so that's kind of how the lens that we're going to look at it today. So can we define access? Yes and no, right? We could, through rules and regs, talk about, how many containers there need to be, location, density, the form factor, right? Is it what colors, what size are acceptable containers in the city? Signage, we're going to be talking about that in July. Also, what materials are being accepted in the system on premise, right? In theory, you could say, hey, I'm providing recycling access and it's just for glass. Is that truly access? Open for discussion, right? And lastly, I touched on alternative zero waste strategies. So there might be other ways to achieve compliance without providing access. You might be a zero waste business. You might not have a waste stream to dispose of. Next slide. So we're gonna play a little game. Who wants to take a guess as to which of these three are providing access? Again, this is front of house, multifamily, residential, recycling only. We're not talking about composting. Just on these basic examples, you have a multifamily apartment building with a chute. You've got maybe a condo or a multi-unit building with carts set out. And also another multifamily condo or multi-unit property with a large container, a dumpster. Anyone want to participate?
All of them. All of them.
That's right. You guys can't trust me for sure. So all of these three things could be, at the point of inspection, the discretion used to say, yes, okay, these are all providing access, so you guys are compliant. Can we define this in the ordinance? Very difficult, right? To go through all of the parameters and all of the nuance of different building space and size and material streams, right? So we can define, but we also need to have some discretion. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, another set of examples here. Again, this is front of house recycling on the not in a non-residential premise. So think of, a coffee shop or retailer or a supermarket, grocer. All three?
What does the last thing do?
Right, yeah, okay. Great question. This is a kiosk for beverage containers, glass, plastic, you can have. You have a single stream mixed recycling next to landfill. And again, we're only talking about recycling. So just for the moment, forget about composting. And you have another set out front of house with a multi-stream. So you have multiple options to sort of separate. Would all three be providing access? Yeah, right. So you see the difficulty here, I think, of discretely defining for everybody across the board with a broad brush what access truly is. Now, again, we can do that in a way of here are approved options, right? Certain containers, certain colors, size. But to do so directly is quite difficult.
So can you help us understand what access means? So in the last slide, that dumpster is not accessible to me.
True. Yes, so that's a great point. So yeah, thank you. That's great. So again, I think we have some work to do to figure out on an equity piece, what would make sense in terms of those available options. And so that's a great example of, yes, it might be providing access to one person, but to the whole community. We still have work to do there. Yes, please.
Might access also include capacity. If you always go to the recycling, it's always full because management isn't keeping it cleared.
Right.
Could that be an access?
Yeah, so if a container is always full, right? I mean,
Well, that speaks to frequency.
right.
Right, but still it then diminish someone's access to recycle because there is no place.
Yeah. Please.
And coming up with the street definition that you referenced, could we more so think of like a rating system where, say, there's a number of, factors involved, and if you're above 5, you're in compliance, but maybe if you hit 10, where it's ADA compliant, it's in the same spot as the other bins, it's the right color, it's the right service frequency, then you're like a 10 out of 10, but like 7 out of 10 still works, but like you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are criteria that from an enforcement perspective, we can design so that at the point of inspection or at the point of enforcement, there are sort of objective criteria, right? That are standard universal across the board, but then there are also subjective criteria as well. So it's hard to check off a box and say, yes, this container is in the right place. You kind of have to be there in person. It's very face-to-face kind of business when you're identifying or assessing compliance. So yeah, that's a great point. Next slide, Sarah. So again, just to recap, we're not trying to define or access discreetly in the ordinance. We're simply trying to demonstrate how difficult that is. And the preference would be through a rules and regs process to which I believe this task force will have an opportunity to weigh in on. What would you all like to see? And then in the next meeting, we're going to talk specifically about communication and signage. These are just sort of the basic criteria of things that we can start to think about. So next slide. Thank you. We want to talk a little bit about responsibilities too, and sort of this marketplace that's going to be evolving. And so we've also been getting quite a lot of questions about, what is the city and county of Denver's role in this, and what is the private sector's as well. And so we wanted to just visualize and take you down kind of the ecosystem that we're currently living in, but we're about to enter, which is, disposal or recycling, composting happens at the point of discard in a business. So this would be sort of a consumer, right? The business owner is the premise, the responsible party. It's a requirement to have hauling services, right? So there's a hauler involved. And then obviously it wants to go to the right place, right? To a recycling facility or processing facility. So there is a natural incentive in the private marketplace, in a healthy functioning marketplace, where down the line, there are checks and balances on performance, on contamination, on accepted materials. And so we'll start with the recycling facility at the bottom of the chain. What can they do? Well, they can say at the end.
Sorry, the bottom.
Sorry.
Nice.
Thank
Down that
you. We love our processors in there. Thank you. Yeah. So you can exact higher rates and penalties when a hauler shows up with material. You could reject material. You could say, hey, it's too contaminated. Or an arrangement where it's diverted to a landfill. But there's also innovation and investment, right? So processors can anticipate perceived challenges and they can adapt. Now, a hauler, they can provide businesses with education. They can too also have contracts with business owners, properties, where if their material is not consistent or high quality, to exact higher rates and penalties there, they can also terminate a contract. This is sort of the natural flow of a private marketplace, right? And what can businesses do? What can properties do? Well, they can also ensure that they've got the right signage and containers, right? That's the access. That is the responsibility to provide access, is with the business owner. It's not with the hauler, it's not with the processor, right? This is where access is being determined. And so the other thing that business owners can do, and property owners can do, is they could manage their material stream. So they could say, okay, I'm a coffee shop, I'm providing currently 4 different options for a cup. They might be different colors, they might be different sizes. They might be able to standardize that so that it's very easy for them to determine on site what to expect in terms of their material flow. And then they can adjust in-house, their guidance to consumers. So what I haven't touched on yet is what is Denver's role, the Denver government's role in this, right? Well, our job is to be everywhere, all at once, at the same time, right? It's a large responsibility, right? To be communicating on all lenses, all stakeholders, consistently and universally, right? So in that sense, our goal is sort of like to be omnipotent in that way, which will be a challenge. Yes.
Does Denver consider taking a more hands-on approach as opposed to an omnipresence post? Maybe Denver's the hauler. Maybe Denver creates a sorting facility, regional, that deals with the stuff so that landfill isn't the only diversion option. Are there any thoughts to that? Is that something we have scope on? Is that certainly something with your implementation that you'll influence for years to come?
Absolutely. So there are a whole set of things that are highly relevant to strategy and to support universal recycling and compost. This is traditionally across the country, cities that have introduced universal recycling and composting. It doesn't live in a vacuum. They needed to create supporting policies and programs. They need to themselves get into the hauling business, processing business. So yes, we do have a large role, and that role might expand based on, willingness and the strategy. So I think what will be really interesting to see from my perspective is how the private marketplace responds to what we're about to require, right? Next slide, please. Oh,
Do you have a
I think it might be interesting to see how some other, so like I know in San Francisco, Recology is a private hauler, but they are the hauler in the city. So
it's a franchise model where there's one hauler and I believe they provide, and I think it's the same in Seattle, if I recall, they provide service to all single family residential and small business. There are some other haulers that are operating, but the vast majority is being managed by one player.
versus what another city that might be doing it themselves for everything first. So I think it might be interesting if we could compare those.
And now that we pay for trash, do we maybe have the city create pathways for small businesses to participate through that? As opposed to only looking for commercial options for the smallest, hardest to implement participants?
Can you expand a little bit?
Small businesses, usually in residential neighborhoods, likely aren't hitting volume or mass to be able to take advantage of the relationship with a large hauler that might not see value in that client. Could there be a buy-in option potentially for businesses small enough for multi-unit apartment buildings that are under 4 or under a certain number to give another layer of access to services and infrastructure we already have with a pay-for-play model that already exists?
Are you saying specifically Gotti, the provided services, or are you saying just like a community coming together and saying?
We collect trash in Denver already. Small businesses in certain size apartment buildings might be better opting in and buying into that service as opposed to shopping a free market that doesn't exist and might never see them as a valuable customer.
I don't believe we're allowed by state law. Yeah.
Mhm.
However, it's very,
Please fix that.
the answer is no.
Can you fix that?
Sorry, state law.
So it's 7.
7. Yes. And what delineates that? Is that rules? Is that state delineates?
Yeah, that's commercial versus. I'm not really sure about that. Something our municipal code creates, the state regulates basically. Like we
Can I interject really quickly, only because I imagine there are a lot of questions about this, and I wonder if there's a way to capture questions in a parking lot kind of situation. So we come back to them, because I really want you guys to have a chance to respond to all this.
Yeah.
Can I, yeah, if I pass out Post-its, I'll create a parking lot. Does that work, Marguerite?
This just isn't a question because the same thing came up in our equity work group, and what Grace suggested was that the task force recommend that the city do a feasibility study for publicly owned or publicly incentivized systems. And for me, that made sense considering the scope of Waste No More. It's really not to say like, hey, city, is set up your own recycling facility or set up your own haulers, but like we can recommend for this ordinance to be successful, that there should be a feasibility study for the best way, you know, so I don't, that would just be my recommendation for most of these questions for that.
Awesome, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about strategy and what we can do, right, to both increase participation and ensure high performance, right? Because we want to achieve our zero waste goal. So in the waste world, there's essentially this concept of an intervention, right? You're stepping in, whether you're city government or you're a hauler or a business owner, and you're at the point of discard or at the point of where the problem is occurring, you're intervening, right? And so the definition is as a purposeful action by an agent to create change. Well, what do we want to change? We want to change behavior, right? We want to, change might be forceful, but we want to influence, we want to motivate, right? And so there's a massive set of tools that we have at our disposal to ensure participation is high and performance is high. So the set of interventions include, but not limited to, these on the left. I want to talk probably about the biggest one, which is about citywide campaigns, and just use, I'm biased, but my favorite example, which is from my old stomping grounds in DC, our effective Do Not Bag Recyclables campaign. This was a citywide initiative. It was everywhere. It was on bus ads, it was in metro ads, it was online, digital. We sent mailers around to all different businesses and residences. We also had a crew, they were called the Feet on the Street. We went out and inspected curbside containers. Through all of this work, over the course of a couple of years, we were able to reduce contamination by 33%. Pretty significant change in a short amount of time. So again, contamination, performance, these are things that we're thinking about. And ultimately, we need to design effective programs for that. Next slide. Lastly, I just want to, from our perspective, from sort of an unfiltered perspective of a municipality, what does really success mean in the short term? Well, we'd want to see volumes up. We want to see participation up. Okay. We want to make sure that the access we're providing in the city is being utilized. Are people aware of the requirements? Contamination, we want it to be manageable, but we can't solve for it immediately. I'll explain why. But we do want to manage it. We want high compliance rate for business. So are they providing access? Meaningful usage rates and support incentives. So the things that we're creating as a city, are they being used? That's a good indicator for success. And then lastly, what does the investment look like regionally? Is the private sector stepping in? Does the government need to do more? Right? These are all sort of short-term measures for success. On the long term, solving for performance and contamination requires, as Chris mentioned earlier and alluded to, a lot of data collection. So not only do we need to communicate to everyone all together, we also need to be sampling across all different sectors in the city, gathering, doing waste audits, assessing what contamination looks like, what is in the material mix. From that, we can identify where there are gaps, design effective interventions, and then validate whether those interventions are working, and then you just reiterate, and that process continues. Please, Chris.
You got me really excited before when I brought up this measurement of current compliance out of curiosity. And I honestly thought you were going to show me a slide with percentages in it.
I wish I could.
What do you think it would take to get that type of data? How quickly could we collect information like that? Not 100%, but at least a good awareness of the total volume of we know we produce and where we think it's going.
I don't know if private haulers.
I would,
And I'm gonna, oh, and also, can we put it,
Yeah.
Chris, can I put that on the parking lot,
Please.
bike rack?
I mean,
Because, yeah, I'm gonna keep us moving. Scott,
Yep.
something real quick? Yeah.
There's a piece missing in the short term, what does success look like? And that is the finished product. And on the organic side, we have a circular thing. It's here, it's happening here, it's happening now. And so the success is that product getting utilized back in the municipalities and wherever it's being used. So it's got to be used. We're just not gonna make it and have it sit at our compost site. It's got to be back in the system, and that's gotta be a part of what the success looks like, at least on the organic side.
right, perhaps I'll tweak for another time, usage rate of finished compost, finished products, circularity.
And absolutely.
Sonia has her hand raised.
Excuse me?
Sonia has her hand. raised.
Sonia.
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
The other thing I want to talk about is I'm all for education. And I think obviously, I don't disagree with anything here. I think certainly we want people to be in compliance and we want it, we don't want contamination, that kind of thing. I'm just sitting here thinking like a nightmare situation of like a restaurant having their recycling and their composting containers and whatever, and like customers coming in and accidentally putting things in the wrong place, or even an employee that you try to train. How and when are we going to talk about those types of things? Because I think education absolutely is something that we are going to have to do a lot. But what I'm worried about is people who are trying to do the right thing. And then is there a chance people are going to get penalized because somebody else threw something in their bin that they didn't realize? Like, how detailed are we going to get here?
It's a great segue into the next slide of what enforcement could look like. And then I'm going to pass it off to Erica. But in short, contamination or performance that we're talking about is not a compliance issue. So if and we'll kind of walk through, this is sort of just a very sort of boilerplate established, lean process for conducting enforcement. And this can be considered, just for best practices in other cities on how to design lean, effective processes. But essentially you'll see here, I'll just summarize, basically on this diagram, there's 11 steps before you begin NOV. And the biggest thing I want to highlight is this box right here of a warning and a technical assistance. This could be weeks. This could be many lengthy discussions on how that business can become compliant well before they get issued a ticket. So I think this is a passive, called the passive model, where there are objective criteria, like I mentioned, but there's also subjective discretion. And if an inspector reaches a property and they determine that there is hardship, that there is some real reason why they cannot comply, the discretion would be obviously to help them, not to exact penalties. So again, for those really worried about whether the city is going to be, have that sharp stick ready to go, yes, but there are many steps before we get there.
And also,
yeah.
and to just, I know that I've heard many, many times, and at the same time, there's a huge interest in encouraging compliance through all these other mechanisms. So that's happening concurrently.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we have enough time in our small groups and we only have half an hour left. So Councilman Hines, do you want to put something out there before we get?
If we already are working on one solution, we as an SEIU, like the Green Janitorial Program, is helping create better streams. And I wonder if we could do that something similar with other industries like restaurants. And as far as compliance, I mean, Dottie is, in the city role, we already are looking at cameras whenever we have a recycling, bin, and we're using cameras, and hopefully, if image recognition or AI or whatever technical buzzword you want to use for stream management and stream compliance. So I'm not sure that I'm super excited about saying that a dirty stream is not considered in the triage process, because we already are doing that with the city. Yeah, to clarify, I would say it's definitely a part of the triage. It's just not, again, from the street perspective of the ordinance as it's written. Performance is not covered. It's about active. So we can certainly step in and say, hey, you have a dirty string. Here's how you can clean it up. Here's handout, here's toolkits. We're already starting to think about some of that. So, Erica, you wanna?
So I'll be super brief so we can get into our work groups. Next slide, please. And just to set the stage, and I know this is a little bit hard to read on the big screen. So I apologize for that, but we want you all to think when you go into your small groups about compliance and enforcement. People usually think of them separate, right? But at least through one agency of the city, right? Excise and licenses, we are an education first organization. We are always compliance rather than punishment, right? Our number one goal is to get folks into compliance, help them get there, right? And there are tools that are not what people think of as enforcement tools that are all part of that toolbox, right? So I listed a bunch here that we use in other places. I won't go through all of them, but things like automated notices or complaint notification system, doing inspections either on a scheduled basis or on a complaint basis, right? They have education first enforcement over here with guidance resources and process navigation. We also use tools like compliance assistance software, and we try to collaborate with other agencies to say, hey, if someone comes to get a different permit, maybe our systems can talk to each other and let them know, hey, did you know you still have this outstanding thing with this other department? Oh, I didn't know that. Do you want to take care of that now? We're streamlining where we can. So a lot of things outside of warnings, notices, fines, and penalties, right? That's what people typically think of as enforcement, but there's actually a lot of different tools that the city uses across the board. And so when you break into your small groups, if you want to hit the next slide, we really want you to think about, and we'll have this kind of graphic up so you can refer to it, but of the tools listed or any other ones that you've encountered in other places or in other systems, right, or other cities, what tools are going to motivate compliance and why, right? That's what we really want to get to the heart of. And then which tools feel maybe overly punitive and why? And then again, are we missing any, right? I know I didn't give you an exhaustive list. It's just all the ones I could think of when I was working on the slide deck, but we really want to get to that, which ones feel right for Denver, that feel right for this program, knowing that we're going to have eager adopters, jumping in a month after, and you're going to have people like Councilman Hines mentioned who will not participate unless they are fined. So, right, we're looking at knowing that that's the spectrum. What tools do we want to put in our toolkit, and which ones do we say, maybe that one doesn't feel quite right. So that's going to be the gist of the small group breakouts.
Awesome. So a couple things about getting your small groups. First of all, online folks, task force members, you're going to meet with Sophia in a breakout group, and you can go ahead and do that now. If someone wants to, if the group has been created, but in the meantime, for the folks in the room, on the back of your name tag, you should have a colored dot. And if you don't, we'll figure it out. But if your dot is red and it says 1, you're in group 1. And Nina, can we have your group meet over here, like in this space, and you'll just put up your flip chart there. Okay, group 1, meet over here with Nina. Group 2 and 3, you're gonna meet outside the room. So 2 with Jessica, and can they meet right on the other side of the wall? And so you should be green and have a 2. And group 3, you're gonna meet with Erica out in the little lobby area with the comfy chairs that way. Okay. And you should have a yellow dot that says 3, and then group 4 with Robert over here in this corner, and Robert's waving his hand back here. If you don't have a dot, raise your hand and I will help you figure out which group you're in. Everyone should. And oh, right. And so Brian, I'll put you where Ian was going to be, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. And if everyone could come back at like 7 minutes till the hour, can we do that? Yeah. And we're just gonna have rapid fire. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. It's gonna be. Yeah. Yeah.
No, 7 minutes.
7 minutes to the hour.
Oh.
So 4 or 5. So like, you'll have it. Okay, we have Mark. Wait, here we go. You're over here with
Robert.
I did.
Okay. Whenever you get your stuff.
All right, so, everybody, we want to get you all out of here in 5 minutes. Then, really quick. Ryan and Ian, please. Thank you. All right, so. Time, yeah, I would say, yes, no, I agree, we're not gonna have time. Here's, yeah. Well, here's my proposal, because we don't really have time. You all have had a bunch of discussions. I was listening in, some of them were very, you had a lot of overlap. My suggestion was like, if there are any major takeaways that anyone wants to report, like an aha moment or anything like that from your small groups, please speak up, because we want to capture that while it's fresh. But in terms of the flip charts that you put together, I know Erica took a bunch of notes from her group. We're going to consolidate that and put it in the meeting summary and ask all of you to look at it. And we're going to use those in developing the recommendations, and the city is going to use them in putting forth some ideas. But just before we wrap up and talk about what's happening next, any major.
We had a really interesting one that maybe the code around trash enclosure might need to change.
The zoning code.
The zoning.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anything else? I kind of read already.
And it's in your, I assume everything that's in your notes. Okay, in the notes from the Rose.
I think with that, we should talk about number of parking spaces for buildings, and so they never required amount of parking spaces that they need. They can, reduce that by putting in these enclosures.
Right.
Because, you have to trade off, and maybe we're not. Or these two.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I assume that's in your small groups.
No, it didn't.
No. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. All right, we'll include it. All right, any other final ahas? Anna, sorry, I know you're doing multiple things at once. Do you mind advancing this? Yep, next one. Okay, just a reminder, this is their schedule. The signage folks, signage, education, communications, you're on deck, and I think Nina's gonna be in touch.
Yeah, so I can, I guess, quick timeline, so I started a doodle poll to have the education signage working group meet in the next 2 weeks. So I guess I'll probably send that out early tomorrow.
Okay.
And then if you could fill it out by Monday, end of day. I know that's super fast, but quick.
Yep, as soon as you can.
And so then we can get a meeting on the books, and we'll meet in the next 2-ish weeks. So we're ready for the last week.
Awesome. We really appreciate it. As quickly as you all can meet, it'll be good to hear your ideas. And then Anna, you can go to the final slide. This is the final slide, the next one. Which is, okay, here's what's happening next. Obviously, there was a lot of conversation from today. So the staff is gonna have a lot to do. The C&D work group is gonna be meeting. The signage and communications group and education group is gonna be meeting. There may be, staff may convene the other two work groups if, depending, they'll be in touch with you all. Ryan?
And potential composting working group.
Yes, okay,
That is on the short list for this.
good, because that has been something that's been discussed, and anyway, sounds like dots are being connected, great. Any other things? I think the other thing, the just final thing is, you heard about August, there's gonna be a public input period. Please start talking. I assume that all of you have been talking with your network, but please continue to do that. Let them know there will be this opportunity, and know that you all are going to be tapped, I think, by the city to engage your people in that comment period, in whatever way. We'll talk about it next month, but just heads up if you put that on your radar. And I think with that, Ian.
Is it gonna be solely written? Like written input? I'm just.
when I asked Grace, and I know she's not here, but my sense is there will be written. But then there will also be, I think the OSCI, the Office of Social Innovation Equity talked about focus groups. So there, I think will be some targeted focus groups. And then I think the goal would be to talk with all of you about how you see engaging other key constituencies and actually using the people power in this room to help do that. So I think, did that answer? I think that's the idea, but I assume we'll talk more
Yeah,
about it.
we're super sensitive to the fact that as we get towards public input and comment, we need to create equitable access to the community. And so we're talking that through about what would make most sense given our timeline. So,
Cool.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Any Blake, Erica, anyone else? Final
I
thoughts?
just want to thank everybody for being so active in this public engagement process. Today was great in terms of the conversations and what we're talking through. A little painful, yeah, but this is the real heart of the ordinance. And so today I think can be celebrated as a win. We're clarifying, we're learning. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you so much. Online folks, thank you so much for your patience and graciousness, and go Nuggies.
Thank
Very
you.
much. Okay, thank you, good night. I'm sorry, what were you